Okay, everybody. It is Tuesday night, the 10th, and my name is Austin Auger. I am with Sports Basement, and we are very excited tonight to have Katie Arnold with us, coming all the way from New Mexico, right?
You're right, Santa Fe.
All the way, yeah, Santa Fe, New Mexico. Excellent. And I'm sure you're already well aware, but Katie is multi-talented. She is a contributing editor and former managing editor at Outside Magazine. You may know her from Raising Rippers, which is a pretty popular column about kind of raising adventurous outdoor kids, which if you're a Sports Basement customer, you probably are into that sort of thing. She's also an elite ultra runner. We are just talking a little bit about cycling. She cycles too. And she has also recently written a book. On top of all that, it seems like she's kind of, she's got some excellent tips. It was about like the zen of running and just a whole lot of other stuff. So we're very excited to have Katie tonight. Katie, how are you doing this evening?
I'm great. I'm psyched to be here. I can't see anyone's faces. I just see their really pretty pictures. If anyone feels like putting their face on the screen, I promise I won't call you out, but it helps me. I love that direct connection. But yeah, I'm excited to be here, and thanks for hosting me. I've been doing a book tour, virtual book tour, for my book, which Austin mentioned, Running Home, is just been released in paperback by Random House. And when it came out, I guess about a year and a half ago in hardcover, I did the traditional book tour, like the flying around the country and going to bookstores and running clubs. And it was great. But I have to say the virtual book tour is pretty convenient because I'm upstairs in my writing loft, and my husband and two kids are downstairs. They're actually assembling a bed, but then they'll be making dinner. And yeah, so it's really a great way, like kind of my approach to running and writing and life is that it's all combined, right? I don't compartmentalize those parts of my life. I wrote a piece about this after I won the Leadville 100 about how my training plan was really just living and running a lot, but incorporating my whole life into my running. And that's really how I live my life and how I write and how I run. And so in a weird way, and that's kind of what Running Home is about, like life kind of works out in strange ways. And we think we might be going in one direction, and but actually life is leading us in another that's probably our true path if we can open to it. And so I'm fully embracing the virtual book tour and kind of what that has to offer, and how I can connect with people all over the country from my home, and you guys are all in your homes. And I think that's, again, my approach to running and life is like to see the positives. And this has been such a challenging time for everyone with COVID and having to shift and do things different ways. But I really believe that these times of change and even struggle can lead us to incredible places that we never thought possible. And that's certainly what happened with Running Home. And I'll get to that in a second, but I also wanted to just give a shout out to Protect Our Winters. Some of the proceeds from this are going to that nonprofit, which I support as an outdoor athlete. I'm a professional ultra runner, but I came to running as a multi-season, multi-sport athlete. So mountain biking, skiing, backcountry skiing, kind of everything. Coming up as a writer at Outside for many years, I just did all of those things. And so as an outdoor athlete, who's really concerned about climate change, and especially in the arid Southwest, where we have a ski season, but every year it's like, cross your fingers that it's going to happen. And as a mother of two children, and if you're parents too, I'm sure you're wondering this, like, what kind of world will all children grow into? Will there even be skiing? Or, what kind of dramatic effects on the climate will there be? And so Protect Our Winters is an important one for us. We're big time skiers. And but it's really geared for outdoor athletes and outdoor enthusiasts who care about climate and want to make a difference. So if that sounds like you, you can check out what they do more at protectourwinters.org. But it's really, climate is, just as someone who has always found solace in wild places, both as an athlete, but also even before I was an ultra runner, as a writer, where I go for inspiration. Um, Climate is like the top of my list of concerns, and as a parent. So yeah, I encourage you all to check that out, Protect Our Winters. And just a quick note before I go into kind of talking about my story and running home, and how there's really embedded in the book a message for all of us now as we navigate these uncertain times. I do want to remember to say, if you haven't picked up a copy, it's just out in paperback. You can get it at any local bookstore. I'm a huge reader, and I really encourage you to support your local booksellers. You can get it on Amazon, of course, but bookstores are kind of the beating heart of our communities. So if you haven't picked up a copy, go grab one. If they don't have one in stock, they'll be happy to order. I've been ordering like crazy from my bookstores. They'll do curbside if you're, restricting your shopping due to COVID. So please support your store, local bookstores, and your local artists and writers there as well. And if you do buy one and you're interested in gifting one to someone, I have personalized book plates that I am more than happy to personalize and inscribe for you. If you send me your email and just say like who I should write it to, and I will pop it in the mail, and then you can put it in your book. And at book signings in person, we sign books. So this is kind of the next best thing. And I think Austin will post my email address. Is that right?
Yeah, so we will be sure. I totally forgot about that. Obviously, the Bay Area, we are rich with independent local bookstores. Definitely support them if you can. And as I mentioned, like we'll do a follow-up email after this. We'll include the contact information for Katie. So if you do want to get a signed book plate as a gift for yourself, you'll get that information. You'll also, if you happen to have a private group when you want Katie to come speak to your running group or another active group, or any group, I guess, I suppose Katie would be, I'm sure, open for that. Yeah, so that'll definitely be coming after. And then I forgot to mention earlier, we have a more of like an intimate evening tonight. So Katie's going to speak for a little bit about her story, and then we are going to allow you guys to unmute yourselves, and we'll just have a nice open discussion, kind of a roundtable discussion, and you can ask any questions that you have of yourself. But that's enough of me for now. No, you didn't come to hear me speak. So.
Yeah, and also if you're shy or don't necessarily want to unmute to ask, you can always put it in the chat. As Austin mentioned, I've been doing these Zoom events. I talk to book clubs and running clubs and training groups. I also talk to teams, schools. So I'm a really open person. You can ask me anything. It can be about running, grieving, life, writing, whatever. So I'm going to talk, and then we'll open it up. So just kind of a little bit of background about running home. It's interesting because it's being called a running book, and it's certainly about running, right? If you look at the cover like that's me at age 7 or 8. But originally it was conceived of, and still is in my mind, a memoir, a father-daughter story, a literary memoir about my relationship with my father and the events that transpired during and after his death. And so in 2010, my father was diagnosed with kidney cancer, and I had just given birth to my second daughter. She was a couple months old. So I had a newborn who was growing kind of as fast as my father was declining. And his illness progressed very quickly. And so I was flying back and forth from Santa Fe, where I live, to his farm in Virginia, where he and my stepmother lived. And I was bringing the baby. And as I went back and forth, the what I discovered was that, and I knew that grief was an emotional state, and I thought that's really what it was. But I learned during his illness, and certainly after he died, that grief is also a very physical experience. And so I developed, my body hurt. I had like, it just felt like a heavy weight. And if anyone here has been through grief, you probably can relate to that feeling of just a lot of physical pain and discomfort. And what happened though for me, because I didn't know, like now I know that that's not uncommon. It's sort of a sympathetic grief response, right? You're kind of taking on the pain of the person you lost. I didn't know that at the time. And so I began to become anxious that I was dying too. And so the grief morphed into this very acute anxiety where, and I'd never had that before, where I thought, every ache in my body. And as runners, you probably, or athletes, you probably can relate to this, that you're very attuned to how your body feels. And so any kind of new sensation, if you're an athlete, you pay attention to it. Some people are like, I don't know. I don't really live in my body. I don't know what it feels like. But I had a heightened awareness. And so I became very alarmed that that I was dying. And because I live in Santa Fe, New Mexico, where I've been for 25 years, there's many different kinds of natural healers here, like practically on every street corner. And I tried many of them, right? I'm a very open person. So I was in such discomfort, and it was kind of a mashup of grief and postpartum and some middle age like mortality, where you're like, oh my God, actually, like people do die. It's real, right? Like that's what youth is. Youth is sort of skating along thinking it's going to happen to other people. And then you lose a parent or someone very close to you, and you realize like actually it's all of us. And so I tried all these different healers, and some of them worked and some of them didn't. But the thing that worked the best was the thing that had always worked for me, and that was running. And so I began to go out into the wilderness, and I've always been a trail runner. For me, running is a way to move through wild places. It's less gear intensive than biking. Austin mentioned we were talking about biking. I used to be a big mountain biker. I just love to be in nature. I've always been that way. A lot of that was my father's influence. He was a National Geographic photographer. And so we always were outside, sort of exploring. But then after my kids were born, I had these babies to maintain. I was like, I cannot maintain my bicycle. I need simple. So I kind of went back to my roots as a runner. And I've been a runner since I was very young. And so I was in that grief state, and running was the only time I could find relief from that endless, worried, anxious loop in my brain, which is, it's not rational. It's totally natural, but it's not a rational thought process. And so when I would move and go into nature, for the first 15 or 20 minutes, of course, you have that to-do list in your brain, right? Or like all the things that you're worried about, or I have to go to the grocery store, I have to do this, or I missed a deadline. But as you run, those thoughts kind of melt away, and you become this sort of rhythmic body in motion. And it's that repetitive physical motion. And running, it's so easy. It's easier to get there because it's such a simple motion. And so what I would do is as I would run, I would find myself in kind of this moving meditation. And when I was in that state, as I said, I was free from those thoughts. And so the more I felt free from that and that relief, the more I wanted to run. So I was running longer and longer distances. And just as sort of background, my father and I were very, very close. As I mentioned, he was a photographer for National Geographic. And so he was this creative influence in my life. And he was also, so he gave me this sort of curiosity for capturing what I saw around me. And he did that as a photographer. His medium was photographs, but mine very early on, right around the time I was 7, not coincidentally, I think when I first started running, was when I realized I wanted to be a writer. And so my father, showed me how to pay attention in the world. And that's so important
as a writer or any kind of artist, right? It's about seeing those moments as they're happening, really being awake to the world. And so that was a big gift that my father had given me, and one of the reasons we were so close. But the other was, as I mentioned, that we shared this love of the outdoors. And is actually my father, and I write about this in Running Home in an early chapter, who was the one who suggested I try running. And it was a total lark. It's one of my favorite chapters in the book because I'm 7 years old and I'm visiting his farm in Virginia. He and my mother had split up. And he just suggested on a whim, like, hey, girls, that I had a sister, I have a sister. And he said, there's a 10K race in a nearby village. What do you think about running it? And my sister and I were like, well, we didn't even know what 10K was. Like, it was not like we'd been training. I mean, it was childhood. It was the 70s, the late 70s, right? Like, it's a different world where kids just went outdoors and played, and that was us. And my dad wasn't even an athlete. That was also the best part about this story. Like, he didn't have any ambitions. Like, so often now as parents, I'm guilty of this, but like it's really easy to like foist our ambitions on our kids. But my dad was just, he was a photographer. He just was into story, right? And he was into storytelling. And he was like, let's just see what this is like. And my sister and I ran that day, or I should say, like, jogged, limped, walked, but we finished the race. And it was that day that I, in my mind, knew I was a runner. And so the book unfolds from there, and sort of my lifelong relationship with running. There was always a very personal thing. It was what I did. Like, it was an intrinsic love. And you hear that a lot. And as a writer for Outside, where I write a lot about bringing up kids outside, or that intrinsic like love of something is so important with kids, because if they're doing it for external reasons, that's what leads to burnout, injury. It's not coming from within. And so fortunately, because I grew up in that time where parents just, it was like that benign, like, neglect. Like, my mom was like an eyeball looking out the window, and as long as I came home from for dinner, she didn't care what I did. And so I got to have this very personal relationship with running, and it was very much tied to my creative process as a writer. So early on, I sort of just accidentally discovered that when I move my body, I also move my ideas in my head. And that was part of how I got my imagination going. And so movement and being outside in nature, where nature is big enough to hold everything we've got and is kind of indifferent to us in a really beautiful way, right? Like, so you can have all these difficult emotions, like when I was grieving my father, but in nature I felt this relief that it was bigger than me, and my grief was tiny compared to the mountains and the trees and the forests. And so as a child, I just ran for myself. I didn't join the track teams. I wasn't competitive. I have thought in the past, like, oh, I regret that. Like, I could have been really good if I wonder if I'd gotten to college on a scholarship. And I used to regret that. And now I realize that actually probably would not be running. I may not be running with this much joy and passion and success in my 40s if I had, burned up on the competitive field then. And so it's sort of the gift. And again, like, life works out the way it does, and it usually works out the way it should. And so I ran, and so after my father's death, I found myself running more and more, and again, just for my own personal self. But when I emerged from that sort of initial triage period of grief, after about 18 months, and I could finally claw my way out of the fog of grief, I realized, like, oh, I love this. And it feeds me. These ultra distances feed me in this way that I was so curious. I felt like I'd only scratched the surface of understanding what it was about. And of course, as runners, if you're a runner, you know that running is about way more than running, right? Like, all the time we spend with ourselves, it's really about studying our minds and knowing ourselves. People love to say running, oh, you're running away from something. And some days that's true. Like, I'm running away from the dishes in the sink, or my deadline, or, whatever it is. But most of the time I'm running towards something. and I'm running toward my true self and kind of my full potential. And I think that's really what the title of the book represents to me, is that you're running home to yourself. And so when I came out of that period, as I write in the book, I began to explore competition and running, um, on ultra marathons, to just explore that edge of like, how deep could I go into my mind, the farther I went into nature and the farther I went on my feet. And that's really the sort of where the second half of the book goes, is exploring that edge. And early on, and then in a minute, I don't know how long I've been talking, but I'm going to wrap up in a few minutes. And but I wanted to share this other scene in the book that it means a lot to me, and may resonate with you if you're in the Bay Area. I'm not sure where you guys are, but when I was, as Austin mentioned, I worked at Outside magazine, and I still do, but I'm freelance. But when I was on staff with them, I think it was 2007. Yeah, it was before I had my first daughter, but Outside asked me if I wanted to do a profile of Dean Karnazes, ultra runner extraordinaire from the Bay Area, who was out on, running across the country as part of his 50 marathons in 50 states in 50 days. And I said, sure, of course I'd love to interview Dean. I didn't really know him. I was way into running, but I was not at all into ultras. I just ran up my mountain every day as kind of a writing practice, really. But I said, sure. And so I called Dean and I was like, hey, Dean, this is Katie from Outside. I want to set up an interview. You're coming through. He was going to do his New Mexico marathon in Albuquerque. And it wasn't an official marathon. In other words, it wasn't a race. But he'd mapped out the course, and he'd invited some local runners, and he's like, sure. And I said, well, Dean, I'll meet you. I'm only going to do about 6 miles with you, and I'll meet you like 6 miles from the finish. And Dean's like, no, just meet me at the start. And I was like, well, all right, if Dean tells me to meet him at the start, I'm going to meet him at the start. But I said, for sure, Dean, but I'm only going to run 6 miles, and I'm definitely going to peel off. And he's like, okay. And so I show up, and I've got my like little digital like audio recorder, like a good journalist, around my neck. And I'm going to interview him while we run. And fortunately, because Dean is doing a marathon every day for 50 days, he's not like setting a blistering pace. And the longest I'd run before that, I'd done the Imogene Pass trail run, which I think was 17 miles at high elevation in Colorado, but nonetheless, 17 miles. And that was the year before. So like, there was no way I was going to run that far with Dean. Didn't even cross my mind. And, but we start running, and he's so engaging, and he's so easy to talk to. And we're just kind of like, we're flowing. I mean, it's just like this easy pace. And the next thing I know, we get to this 13-mile mark, and it's a turnaround. It's a there and back. So I was like, oh crap. Like if I peel off now, like I'm still have to walk home. So I might as well run the whole thing. So there I turn around, and Dean's like, I think you're running the whole thing. So fully by accident did I run my first marathon with Dean Karnazes. And the reason I love this story, though, is because while we were running, as a good journalist, I was interviewing him, and I wanted to know his secrets to running insane distances, because Dean's story is famous. Like, he'd run overnight, 120 miles. He'd call for pizza to be delivered. He'd run through the Taco Bell takeout, and Dean's strategy, his secret was simple. He's like, you're stronger than you think you are, and you can go farther than you think you can. And that just like blew my mind, but I didn't leave that day with Dean. I was totally changed. I felt it like on a cellular level, but I didn't do anything with it for 6 years. It just was working its little magic in me. Wherever those things go in your brain, the little nooks and crannies, it was working. My unconscious was digesting that and absorbing it. And so that when my father died and I was so lost in the fog of grief, I couldn't see my way forward. I thought I was dying, and I started running. Those words came back to me. And they stayed with me, and they stayed with me as I ran my first ultra, my first 50K, and then moved up in distance. And I tell that story because it's really important. Like, we're all in this period of anxiety and uncertainty, like on a collective level. And all the things we thought were set are not. They're up in the air, school, work, everything, politics. Um, and so that can feel really unsettling. And that's certainly what grief feels like. If you've been through grief, that, like, you're in another world. It's like the real world's going on out there, and you're in your own bubble. But what I learned, and what is one of the big themes of Running Home, is that even as we're in that period of that fog and uncertainty, it's really uncomfortable for things to be so uncertain, but it's also a very generative time. Like, it can lead you places, and you're growing on the inside, even while you feel like you're sort of paralyzed on the outside. And so that when I finally did pop out, I felt that I had grown in these tremendous ways that I didn't know at the time. And that gives me hope right now, because I'm in it too, like the rest of us. Like, when is this going to end? We don't know. We can't see our way forward. And I just keep reminding myself, and my book is a great teacher, even for me. Like, I feel like I keep learning the lessons that it taught me the first time around, which is like, oh, right, when you feel like you're in that eddy, like I write about that in the book, like those swirling eddies in a river, like where you're just going nowhere, you're actually growing. And it can be a very fruitful time. So I hope that's something that we can take with us. And I'm happy. I feel like I've been yakking, but I'd love to talk about running or training or how to get through this weird time. Any questions people have, we can, just hop in and go for it.
Awesome. Thanks. Those are some great stories. I love that story about Dean too. It's
Yeah.
I mean, it's just, I feel like it fully encapsulates like just Dean's spirit and everything. Like, at the few brief moments I've seen him in person, it's just like,
Yeah, he is really larger than life.
inspiring.
And
Yeah.
someone recently sent me the archival photo. I'm sure it was actually taken on like a film camera.
Yeah.
Well, maybe not quite, but it was certainly not a camera phone, but of us crossing the line in Albuquerque. And like, it's just hilarious. Like, that was my first marathon. And it's sort of like the same way my 10K was a total accident. That marathon was an accident. And yeah, but Dean has been a huge supporter of the book. And we've crossed paths like out in Marin at the Marin Ultra Challenge. And he's such a great ambassador for the sport. And I love his spirit. And so he was a huge influence.
Awesome. Well, what I'm going to do, I mean, I definitely have my own questions for sure, but I will not be too greedy, and I'm going to open up. So everyone, I'm going to allow you guys to unmute yourselves right now. So if you do have any questions or comments or whatever you want to ask Katie, and I mean, there's so many things, like if you check out her website or read her book, like there's so many things that she can discuss. So I'm going to allow you guys to unmute yourselves right now. So any questions, by all means. Otherwise, I might just take over again.
Again, I don't see any faces, but I see your name. So feel free to, don't be shy. I'm a really easygoing question answerer. No one.
Well, I'll get started here.
Okay, yeah, you break the ice.
I've got a bunch here. Can you just like touch on kind of there's a phrase that you use a few times called on your website and some other stuff I've seen, called the Zen of running, especially in kind of the current climate, just with COVID and the election. Like, I feel like the brains are kind of buzzing right now with so much stuff. Can you explain like what the Zen of running is, and
Sure.
how can we achieve that state?
Yes. Okay. Great question, Austin. So the Zen of running is kind of, the way I see it, is letting go of the result that you want, right? And so not running for that goal or the end result, but running for the experience in the moment. And so, and that ultimately, I think if you're able to be present in that way, will lead you to the result you want. But it's sort of, it's flipping it around. Like as runners, I think, many of us are very goal oriented, or we have that A race off in the future, and kind of we build our whole life or our whole season, or if it's an ultra, like our whole year around that race. And we may even be like building it around a time goal, or like an age group, or a podium goal. And my approach has always been pretty unconventional compared to other, I think, competitive athletes, but I flip it around. And so like the goal for me is the feeling each day. And so I'm running, like if I don't feel it, if in other words, like if I'm not feeling the joy of running, or the inspiration, again, like because running for me is so linked to my creative process, if I'm not engaged with the running, or energized, or just like happy as a runner, then I'm probably not going to meet those end goals. And so it's really like Zen is all about being present in the moment, and letting go of what are called gaining ideas. So like letting go of like trying to get somewhere with your meditation, trying to achieve something. And that's not to say like you're being passive. Like it's not like I'm going to I'm not going to show up and do my runs. No, it's about showing up daily and making steady effort for the good. In Zen, there's a saying called continue under all circumstances. So, right, like Austin and I were talking about, winter weather has come to Santa Fe, like show up anyway. Show up in that day. And that's that Zen approach, that when you do that and you're wholehearted in each day's effort, then it will lead you to, more than likely, to some form of the result you're looking for. But if you put the result first, you are just in that clutching, kind of wanting mode that it's easy to fall into, especially if you're doing lots of races. It sort of gets acquisitional, where it feels like I'm going for that. I just ran a race Saturday, so I got another one of those medals, right? And they're fun to have. And I'm like, I had my daughter put it up on my little hook. It's fun to have a lot of those, but like it gets sort of like acquisitional, where you're like, I want more, more, more. And you lose sight of like what the feeling is. So I always go on feeling. And for many years, I didn't have a coach. I didn't go on data. I wear a watch, but really only for distance. And so I think I naturally came to that approach myself. But I've just seen it play out for me. Like Leadville 100 was a perfect example of how the Zen of running sort of took me to place. Like did I ever think I would win Leadville? No, but everything aligned around that, because I had let go. I wasn't focused on the end. I was focused on the process, if that makes sense. And meditation is certainly a big part of my training. And it's kind of more and more, I touch on it in Running Home, where I had started to sit because of my anxiety, and meditating, even just 5 minutes a day, can really help with anxiety if you're feeling that now in this during COVID. But then sort of I began to sit more and more. I still only do like 10 or 12 minutes a day, but it became really fundamental to my run training, that mindset training, where when I sat, I could get really quiet and hear myself, and make sure that I was always centered on why I was running, which, competition is the tiniest part of it. As if I was running for the joy of it, to be in nature, to write, then I knew I was centered. If I was running because I thought I had to prove something because I'd won Leadville, or I needed to impress my sponsors, that was a red flag to me. Yeah, I hope that answered your question.
Absolutely. Definitely.
Yeah, and people think that meditation is like you have to like empty your brain of thoughts, right? And like it's just supposed to be this like blank slate of serenity. Like that's actually not true. I mean, probably there are moments, like I actually got a little bit of taste of that today, but most of the time you have a ton of thoughts. You're sitting, you're trying to be quiet with them. Like you follow I count my breaths. The thoughts come. And this is why meditation is actually really good training for ultra running or any kind of running, is because the thought will come, and instead of grabbing it, you're just supposed to let it go like a cloud. And so probably for me, like when I run, I'll have a lot of those thoughts like, oh my God, my ankle hurts, or, can I hold this pace? Or is the weather going to hold? Like, should I brought that jacket? And you can get, caught in your worries, but meditation has taught me that like, okay, I can just let that worry about my ankle go. And I'll come back to it. Like if in 4 or 5 miles or 30 or 40 minutes, it's still bugging me. Okay, then I can revisit my ankle. But it's really good. It's great practice for ultra running or any kind of distance or endurance event, because you are going to have those thoughts. Just the key is just not to latch onto them. Don't go down the rabbit hole. Thanks. Anyone else?
Sound advice. Very easy to do, right?
Yeah. And I mean, we can talk about training in COVID if I don't know where you guys are located, but if you're able to run right now, or if there's even races. Like I just did a race, only my 3rd race during COVID. And one of the big kind of concepts for me as a runner, and it is sort of tied in with that Zen of running, is to run where you are. Right. And so like we love to travel to exotic places to run, or again, it's that sort of acquisitional thing of like, I want to go do the rim to rim to rim. I love doing that in the fall, or I want to go do UTMB in Europe. And about a year ago, like right before the pandemic started, I went to a race. I went to the Black Canyon 100K in Arizona. And I remember feeling really uneasy about traveling, and I was aware of the pandemic, but it wasn't even that. It felt like a big output of resources. And just sort of circling back to what we were talking about with climate and the environment, it felt like I didn't know. I was questioning whether this idea of traveling to race was sustainable. And did I need to go to Arizona to run this race when I could run 60 or 30 miles right out my door in the mountains of New Mexico? And so I was grappling with that. And then lo and behold, the pandemic happens, and then we can't go anywhere. And so it was such good practice in learning to run where you are with what you've got. And I say this all the time when I talk to parents who are raising their kids who are like, well, I don't have huge wilderness out my door. How can I get my kids into nature? And I'm like, nature can be the park down the street, right? It's about having a relationship and even like an intimacy with your home place. And so running where you are has taken on new meaning for me. So it's like run with what you've got. Maybe your mountain, that you get to run every day is like a highway overpass in Kansas, or maybe you run around your same block in suburban New Jersey, like I did when I was a kid, but that's okay. It's like, it's about showing up and meeting yourself where you are. And so the pandemic has been great for that, but I have not been able to travel. I have 2 kids who are in school, and in order to keep them in school, we have to keep things really locked down here. And but I was able, there was a race in New Mexico on the Continental Divide Trail on Saturday. And so boy, it's like it takes a pandemic to make you really grateful for those local races. And it's been a great reset of priorities, I think, even as it's been a struggle. But I don't know if if you guys are racing or people have races, if things are happening again.
I think from what I've seen, and I know with sports basement especially, like we've been working, obviously all the big races, the turkey trots and the big SF marathon and these things, right? They got canceled or they got kind of converted to the virtual races. Mm-hmm. But so I don't think I could be mistaken. I don't think, but I think in the Bay Area for the most part they've basically become like, you have a week to compete to complete however many miles. But yeah, I think you bring up a great point, I think, right? Like rediscovering like running in your local area is huge. Yeah. And I think like for better or for worse, this time has kind of forced us to do that. And I mean, running is just one of those things, right? Where you can do it. All you need is a pair of shoes and you can go.
I mean, that's the beauty of running. Like, I think that's why so many of us are drawn to it, is that it is so simple. And I'm such a minimalist with running and like low data, and like I'm not on Strava, and um, it is really an elemental relationship between myself and the trail, the mountains, and the weather that day, and my own mind. Yeah, and so you can just go out, and sometimes we have a lot of resistance, and that's normal. I write about that in Running Home, where you're like, for me, right around this time of year, I resist the seasonal change. I resist the cold and the darkness. And like the cold and the darkness are not causing our suffering, but the resistance to it is, right? And that's this idea of Zen, that like when we fight against what is happening and sort of the truth of the way life is, we cause ourself suffering. And so it's just a daily practice though for me, because some days, right, like running is hard and you are resistant to it, or you know, it's not like every day is this, you know, beautiful, glorious, joyful experience. I have those days too where it's a struggle, but going back to that idea of like continuing under all circumstances, like just keep showing up. And you're going to have those down days, even the days when you're like, I can't believe I have to run the same mountain again because everything else is off limits to me. Well, maybe there's a new way to run the mountain. Like, can you run it in reverse? Sometimes when I get really stuck in a rut with running, like I cut down my little yoga mat into like a tiny size, and I'll throw it into my running pack, and I'll run or hike up the mountain, and I'll do yoga on the top, you know, something to mix it up, like, because you will hit those ruts. And for many of us, I think maybe COVID has been a prolonged rut. I think for others, probably it's been a creative time to explore different ways to run, or maybe to really reconnect with the deeper reasons we run, like not just to race. And so to see opportunity, but also just to know that resistance is natural, and like don't beat yourself up over it, just try to keep going. I think if I could boil down the theme of Running Home into 2 words, it would just be keep going, right? Like there's going to be the hard days and the sticky days and the grief, and like we're all in that now. I think whether or not we've lost someone we loved, like we're grieving for how things were and won't go back to, you know, it'll be different. But go anyway, right? Keep going through that. And that, yeah, that works for fear too, right? There, people have a lot of fear around running, or can, and I experienced that a lot as well. And what I've learned is that when we try to beat the fear or pretend it's not there, it gets worse. But when we go into it, right, we can come through the other side.
Cool.
Who else has questions? I see someone had put something in a chat. Let me see. Oh, okay. Book plate. Anyone?
Come on, I know
Don't
there's so
shy.
many
You don't
questions
have
out
to
there.
No. Okay.
Oh.
That's fine. Maybe Austin has another. I mean, I'm happy to keep talking.
Yeah, I've got plenty. No worries about that. I know that your Raising Rippers column was very popular, about kind of like raising like outdoor adventurous kind of kids. And then you've also obviously interviewed like Dean Karnazes and working with Outside. I'm sure you saw a lot of like just elite ultra athletes, and like endurance athletes out there, from whether it's like triathletes or, you know, running or cycling even. Do you feel that, is there like a kind of a common thread in terms of like a catharsis that people find doing endurance versus, I mean, because it is a very different kind of mindset when you're doing 50 miles versus a 5K. Is there kind of, have you noticed like a common thread, and do you see that in kids that do?
I think that, yeah, that's a great question. I think that there is, endurance is different than those more extreme or sort of higher risk, higher consequence sports. I think that what endurance athletes are drawn to is that sort of like the way that we get to spend a lot of time with our own minds, and we get to know ourselves and how we react in different circumstances, right? Like one of the reasons I love ultra running and especially trail running is that there's so many variables.
Mhm.
And, it's not, even though my early races as a kid was that road 10K, road races are like, there are fewer factors, terrain is less so, like the technical trail, in trail running, it's like the terrain, it's what's underfoot. This race I ran on Saturday was slick rock, sand, roots. And so, and certainly weather is a factor, and elevation, where I live, I run the mountains out my door go up to 12,600 feet. And so you have a lot of just unknowns. And I think that is what draws ultra runners to the sport, and probably other backcountry athletes, is that you are negotiating or navigating all these different factors. And it's a really creative process trying to figure out, like, what do I need to bring? How do I take care of myself? I think that's really at the heart of why running has been such a transformative experience for me, because I learned how to care for myself on the trail. What do I need to bring, from the really practical matters of, like, how much hydration do I bring? Like, how often do I have to eat? Oh, I learned I have to eat 200 calories an hour, 300 when I'm above 10,000 feet, but it's also on a more metaphorical level of how can I care for myself? Like, I learned to speak kindly to myself and to be my best cheerleader. It's really easy for all of us, I think, to get into that space of being like, oh my God, you're not so fast anymore. Like, what's wrong with you today? But to flip it and be that voice that we need to hear, which is, and I learned this in a 50-mile race. I think it was when I was training. Yeah, it was when I was leading up for the Leadville, and I was out at this race, and I was having a lot of anxiety, and like worried I might even have a panic attack while I was running. And I don't know why that day was hard. But I didn't have any crew with me on the course. Like, my husband and kids were here in Santa Fe. The race was in not that far away, but I just ran it kind of on my own as a training run. And I started finding myself really worried. And all of a sudden I did this really funny thing. I'd never done it before, but I started talking to myself out loud. And I was like, you're doing awesome, Katie. You're so, like, you're looking good. You're strong. I believe in you. And then I was like, I think that I was saying the things that I wanted other people to say to me, but that I realized that I have to say to myself, like, more than anything, like, right. We want so many things, people to validate us or to support us. And it's nice when they do, for sure. My husband's super supportive of my running. Like, he'll take the kids while I'm running, but like, he's not out on the course, like cheering, being my cheerleader a lot. I mean, he did pace me at Leadville, but most of the time he's behind the scenes. So I have to be that person for myself. And even my mother, who I'm very close to, doesn't really support my running. She worries that I'm going to wreck my knees. She has a lot of worries. And as a mother, I see that, but I wish she could, like, get on board, but she can't. And so in that race, I had this really transcendent experience of like, oh, right, I have to do that for myself. And we have to be that voice. And so running has taught me how to care for myself and, like, to be the positive voice. And just going back to your question though, like, I did spend time with the base jumper and free soloist Dean Potter, who I'm not sure if people are familiar with, but he died in a base accident in Yosemite 5 years ago. But I spent a week with him in the park in, I think it was like 2008, 2007, sort of hanging out with him while he did base jumps and free solos. And for Dean, and this was really inspiring to me, his sport was really a creative expression, which is how running is for me. It was it was an art form for him. And so it wasn't just about taking these risks and being on the edge of death, literally, like with every step. It was about cultivating this deep mindset of concentration and kind of, again, this altered state of focus. And so I think that people are drawn to their sport for different reasons. I would hazard a guess that most of us, the competition or sort of the performative aspects are like this much of it, right? That there's always a deeper well, especially for people who go on to be so successful in what they do and sort of pioneers. Like if it was just about the competition, I don't think that would carry us very far. I don't think that is a very deep motivating factor when you get right down to it.
Definitely, I think that's very, very accurate. That's cool that you got to kind of meet and interview Dean Potter. Like he seems like such a interesting kind of person.
Yeah, he was really deep into his own process.
Yeah.
And again, it's really easy to look at those athletes and be like, oh my God, he has to almost die to feel alive. But it was so different from Dean. And in fact, when I heard that he died, I was truly shocked. I should not have been, right? Like if you just look at the stats, base jumping is the riskiest sport. It has the highest fatality rate. So if anyone was going to die, it would have been Dean. But because he was so centered in his pursuit and it seemed so pure. You think that someone can keep doing that forever. And, he couldn't, but yeah, I remember being so shocked and then being shocked that I was shocked because it was like, well, the stats don't work in his favor. But yeah, I love that about reporting on different athletes and their pursuits, because again, it's always about so much more than what you see on the surface. And that's a scene that I write about in Running Home, where I kind of like I've passed through that initial grief, and I'm really wanting to explore like what is running all about for me. And my husband, who I mentioned, is awesome and super supportive, and he's like always backcountry skiing. Like we give each other a lot of freedom. So there was no question that he would support me in my running. But even he got frustrated one day and he was like, what? I was packing up to go on like a 35-mile self-supported run. And I was like figuring out like where I was going to get water. And he was just like, what is all this for? And I just looked at him and I was like, I don't know, but I know that it's more than about running. It's about more than running. And it was like, and I didn't know it at the time that I was writing this book. I mean, that's an important thing to say too, is that it was never premeditated. Like I didn't see it all mapped out. Like, oh, my dad is sick. I'm going to start running. I'm going to, do well at some races and win. And then I'm going to write a book about it. Like it was not mapped out, because grief is not mapped out. Like you can't see your way forward. And so it took me those years of running through my dad's death to realize that all that time I'd been writing a book. And as a writer and a journalist, I keep notebooks. And so I fill notebooks all the time with just life as I'm living it. I'd filled notebooks when my dad was dying, trying to capture what that was like. Again, not because I wanted to make a book about it. This goes back to kind of the zen of running. I was not like starting at the end being like, okay, I got to keep notebooks and I'm writing a book about it. It was like, I need to capture this. My dad would have captured this and he can't. And so I had all these notebooks, and then I would go running. And as I was running, I realized like whole parts of the story would come to me. And I realized that I was writing the book as I ran. And, so that was kind of cool how like the process was, created the book itself. The running built the book unintentionally, almost like that first marathon or that marathon with Dean, kind of accidentally. I was on top of the mountain, my little mountain in town where I run up all the time. And, I get to the top and I always sit for a minute. I don't know if other runners do this, but I always take a minute to like take it in, just absorb my surroundings. And I remember this one day I was just sitting there and I was like, oh, now I'm running home. And I was like, running home? Of course. Like I'm always running home. Like every time you get to the far end of your run and you flip it to come back, you're running home. But when I got those words, I was like, oh, but it hit me on a deeper level. And I think that was really the day that I realized that
I'd been writing this book without knowing it.
Mm.
So that's what I'm talking about with that sort of formative, like things are happening even when you feel like you're just in the weeds. It's okay. The weeds are a really productive place if you can just be patient.
Excellent. Anybody else?
Yeah. What's
Do
that?
we have any questions coming out of here? People still shy. I mean, they're
People
just
shy.
overloaded.
That's all right. We're cool with that.
Yeah.
Training questions. You can also in the chat enter a chat question. I mean, I'd love to know if people, how people are managing out there. It seems like we live in very different experiences during the pandemic. It's almost like fractured us, right? Like I hear people in, other places, their kids are playing sports and we're totally shut down with sports, and so I think it's pretty just destabilizing as a, right now to try to figure out how to be. And for me, that's why running continues to be so important as a daily practice of like, okay, I feel really lost. I'm still going to go for my run. And it may really not feel good because there's some days you go out, right? Most of the time running makes me feel better. There's still days when you come back and you're like, actually, I don't feel much better, but just show up the next day still, and I will say though, continue under all circumstances. Like I don't want to mislead you. That does not mean do not take rest days. Rest days are continuing, right? Like rest days are how you continue under all circumstances because you need to let your body rest in order to continue. And it's taken me a while to learn that. And this marathon I ran on Saturday, which I won overall, men and women, I had really I felt that I was ready mentally, not just not physically. I mean, I felt I was ready physically, but I felt that super strong inside that no matter what happened, I was running for the right reasons. And so I had this incredible day, this really flowing day out on the trails. And there's a tendency when I come back and I'm like, oh, I feel like I'm recovering well, to keep pushing. And resting is continuing. Today I deliberately took a bike day and yesterday as well. And, it's taken me a long time to get into my thick head that resting is how to go forward. So maybe for some, the pandemic is a form of rest too, which I think we all needed. Did we all not realize how crazy our lives were before the pandemic started and how scheduled and running hither and there and I think there's been some beauty to the slowdown.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's important to kind of find that perspective, right? It's easy to overlook that fact, but it totally change. It flips it on its head when you realize, there's, you have to go about your day differently. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's different, but it's not necessarily the worst thing in the world to have to kind of reset a little bit.
Yeah, to find those opportunities. And I've just been super impressed with how much innovation has come out of this time and how, everything, people are really innovating and because they're forced to, and it's a very creative time. And I think I'm speaking personally here, but I wish our schools could innovate more, on a public level. I understand that it's really challenging, but even just races, I've been so impressed by how people are going virtual and then shifting in person and making things work, right? And what is the saying? Necessity is the mother of opportunity or something, or innovation. Right, we have to change. It was not working, and hopefully this will make us think too a little bit more about our impact on the planet. And do we really need to travel to do those races? Could we maybe pick one or two a year that are really speaking to us, and the rest can we just run where we are? Can we have a relationship with where we live and find the beauty there? Because I think ultimately that's what our planet is asking of us. regardless of the pandemic. But yeah, I've liked reading all those stories about like people seeing more wildlife during the pandemic and like more bird life, like in New York City. And for me, my wildlife count in the last couple weeks has been pretty great. I've seen 2 fox, 2 coyote, 2 bobcat. So it's like, oh, that's a gift, that's a positive to this as well.
Definitely.
Anyone else? I'm
Well,
just talking this whole time, but very happy to. But I'd love to hear other voices if there's anyone. If not, please check out Protect Our Winters. Please think about buying a copy of Running Home if it all speaks to you. And if you want, go to my website, katiearnold.net. I also offer running and writing retreats where we sort of work on developing daily practices that put us in this flow state. Flow, my whole idea of flow is that it's not this elusive state that like you that just exists and that we sometimes dip into. Like Leadville for me was like a 20-hour flow state, but flow actually exists all the time. And it includes the low points, like, right, you need to have the ebb in order to flow. And so what I do is I teach how to create these daily practices in our lives that can prime us for flow. And they're really fun and simple. And the most important thing is that they mean something to you. For me, writing is one, riding my bike. And I don't mean like riding my bike like an athlete. I mean like hopping on my bike and cruising around the neighborhood, looking for stories like I did when I was a kid, like looking for interesting things, kind of collecting. And so I lead these retreats, and we had one in Utah right before the pandemic. And then obviously everything screeched to a halt. But they're for all kinds of runners and all kinds of writers, anyone who has stories they want to tell. People are like, oh, I'm not a real writer because I'm not published. I say that when people say that about running too, like, well, I'm not a real runner. If you run or if you write, like no matter your pace or what you're writing for, whether it's in your notebook or for publication, you're a writer. And so I lead these workshops that are, we do amazing. I've got some coming up in 2021, hopefully in New Mexico, where we sort of explore that connection between movement and creativity and finding flow that then you can bring back into your daily lives, whether it's like in your professional life or as a parent, whatnot. So you can find info about that on my website. And you can also follow me on social media. I'm at Katie Arnold on Instagram and at Raising Rippers on Twitter. And then I'm on Facebook as Katie Arnold or Katie Arnold. I guess my official account is Katie Arnold, author, athlete. But, yeah, feel free to reach out, write, send me a note, follow me. And if you're inclined, send me your email if you want a signed book plate. This book sales right now, it's so interesting because a lot of things are being adversely affected by COVID. I guess the book business is doing well. So people have a lot more time to read. I'm a voracious reader. I'm reading a lot, but it's really important to support writers. And if you feel like buying a copy or gifting it, it's not, as you can probably tell, just about running. And I've heard from so many people who read it who aren't runners. So if you have non-runners who are maybe readers or writers or going through grief, I think that it's has been very useful for people and inspiring as well.
Definitely, and I will include all this information in the follow-up email that I mentioned before, because there's a lot of ways to get in touch and learn more about Katie and kind of get some of her knowledge and expertise on a number of different things. So
yeah,
I'll be sure to include I think I got it all as much as I possibly can in that follow-up.
Yeah, and reach out just offline too if anyone wants to chat. And yeah, I really appreciate you guys being here and taking time out of the whirlwind that we're living through right now. I was hoping we'd be on the other side of things and sort of feel like we are, but
yeah,
continue
progress.
to surprise us. So yeah, thank you so much, Austin. And everyone, yeah, just stay safe and keep going.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Katie from Sports Basement
Thank
and
you,
all of us.
everyone. Take care. Bye.
Have a great night.
You too. Thanks.